March 14, 1893. A small village outside Boston, Massachusetts. The wind carries the scent of melting snow and something else, something heavier, more final. Inside St. Mary's Chapel, candlelight flickers against worn wooden pews, casting dancing shadows that seem to breathe with the grief of those gathered within. At the front of the church, a simple pine coffin rests beneath a crucifix, adorned with wildflowers picked from the last patches of earth not yet claimed by winter's grip. Inside that coffin lies 14-year-old Lisa Royce, her pale hands folded across her chest, her dark hair arranged carefully around a face that death has rendered peaceful. Too peaceful, perhaps, for one so young. Her mother, Margaret Royce, sits in the front pew, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her father, Thomas, a man whose weathered hands have known only honest labor, stares ahead with the hollow eyes of someone who has lost more than he can comprehend. Around them, neighbors and friends fill the small chapel, their hushed voices creating a low murmur of comfort and condolence. Reverend James Whitmore approaches the pulpit, his worn Bible clutched in hands that have blessed countless souls on their journey to the beyond. He clears his throat, preparing to speak words that might offer solace in this darkest of hours. But as his lips part to begin the service, something shifts in the atmosphere of that sacred space. A whisper begins at the back of the church, soft at first, like wind through autumn leaves. Then, growing stronger, more urgent. Heads turn, eyes widen. And there, silhouetted against the doorway, stands a figure that should not, cannot be there. A girl in a pale dress, her dark hair falling around shoulders that rise and fall with shallow breath. Her eyes, those unmistakable brown eyes that Thomas Royce had gazed into since the day she was born, scan the gathered mourners before settling on the coffin at the front of the church. It is Lisa Royce, alive, standing at the threshold of her own funeral service. To understand the terror that gripped that often fell to local doctors with limited training, men who did their best but were working with the tools and knowledge of a bygone era. Across Massachusetts and throughout New England, whispered tales circulated of what people called sleeping sickness, a mysterious condition that could render a person so still, so lifeless in appearance, that even experienced physicians might mistake profound unconsciousness for death itself. Newspapers occasionally carried brief reports of bodies discovered in coffins, showing signs of desperate struggle, though such stories were quickly buried beneath more palatable news. The fear ran so deep that many families had taken to requesting safety bells for their loved ones' graves. Elaborate contraptions that connected a string from inside the coffin to a bell above ground, allowing the prematurely buried to signal for help. Bell towers in cemeteries across the region bore witness to this collective anxiety, though whether any bell ever truly rang from below ground remained a matter of hushed debate. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and dread, the appearance of Lisa Royce at her own funeral was not merely shocking, it was a manifestation of the deepest fears that haunted the collective consciousness of her time. The accounts of what happened next vary, depending on whom you ask, but certain details remain consistent across all testimonies given in the days and weeks following that extraordinary March afternoon. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the village baker's wife, would later swear under oath that she saw Lisa standing in the doorway for nearly a full minute. She was pale as fresh linen, Mrs. Hartwell recalled, but she was breathing. I could see her chest rising and falling. She looked confused, like a child who had woken from a terrible dream and couldn't quite remember where she was. Young Samuel Morrison, just 16 years old and seated near the back of the church, claimed he heard Lisa speak. She said, "Mother," in this voice that was barely a whisper. He would tell anyone who would listen. Just that one word, but it cut through the church like a blade. Mrs. Royce heard it too. I saw her head snap up, saw the recognition and indication of what might have caused such a sudden decline. Several witnesses claimed that Lisa moved beyond the doorway, walking with slow, deliberate steps down the center aisle of the church. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who had known Lisa since birth, insisted that the girl approached her own coffin and stood beside it, gazing down at its contents with an expression of profound confusion. "She reached out her hand," Mrs. Foster would later tell her sister in a letter that would be discovered decades later among family papers, "as if she meant to touch whatever lay inside that box." But before she could, the chaos began. People were screaming, fainting, rushing toward the doors. When I looked again, she was gone, just gone, as if she had never been there at all. Yet even as panic consumed the chapel, several mourners maintained their composure long enough to observe details that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of what had occurred. These witnesses noted that Lisa's appearance, while unmistakably her own, seemed somehow altered. Her skin bore an unusual pallor, her movements were slow and uncertain, and her eyes, those brown eyes that had once sparkled with the vitality of youth, seemed distant, as if seeing something far beyond the confines of that small church. The investigation that followed Lisa Royce's extraordinary appearance at her own funeral revealed a series of disturbing anomalies that called into question not only the circumstances of her death, but the very nature of death itself. When village officials examined the records surrounding Lisa's passing, they discovered troubling inconsistencies. The girl had been found unconscious in her bedroom on the morning of March 12th by her mother, who immediately summoned Dr. Clark. The physician arrived within the hour, and after a brief examination declared that Lisa had passed away peacefully in her sleep. But Margaret Royce's account, given to church elders the day after the funeral incident, painted a different picture. "She was warm when I found her," Mrs. Royce insisted, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and confusion. "Her skin was warm to the touch, and I could have sworn I felt breath." Entries continued in this vein, describing dreams of increasing clarity and detail. By early March, Lisa was documenting nocturnal visions that matched, with unsettling accuracy, the layout and arrangement of her own funeral service. March 8th, the final entry began. "The dreams are no longer dreams. I see it all so clearly now. The flowers, the candles, the faces of everyone I have ever known. They think I am gone, but I will be there. I will be watching. I will make them understand that death is not what they believe it to be." Perhaps most chilling was a loose page found pressed between the diary's final entries, containing a single line written in Lisa's hand. "I will be there, watching." When questioned about these writings, Lisa's closest friend, Martha Richardson, revealed that the girl had been experiencing what she called waking visions for weeks before her death. "She would be sitting beside me in church or walking with me through the village," Martha confided to her parents, "and suddenly she would stop and stare at nothing, her eyes wide with terror. When I asked her what was wrong, she would say she could see her own funeral. She could see all of us crying, and she couldn't understand why no one could see her standing right there among us. The physical evidence surrounding Lisa's burial provided further cause for concern. Thomas Whitfield, the village carpenter who had constructed Lisa's coffin, noted several peculiarities in the wood after the funeral incident. There were scratches on the inside of the lid, he confided to his wife. Scratches that weren't there when I delivered the coffin to the church. They looked fresh, as if someone had been clawing at the wood from the inside. More disturbing still was the condition of Lisa's burial dress, a simple white gown that her mother had sewn with loving care. When church officials examined the coffin's contents in the hours following the service, they discovered that the fabric was disheveled, as if the body within had moved or struggled after being laid to rest. But it was the appearance of the corpse itself that proved most unsettling to those brave enough to look. While undeniably the body of Lisa Royce, several witnesses noted subtle changes in her event as a divine miracle, a sign that God's power over death was absolute, and that faith could overcome even the greatest of tragedies. They organized prayer services and vigils, proclaiming that Lisa had been returned to them through divine intervention. But others, particularly those influenced by the growing spiritualist movement that had taken hold across New England, saw darker implications in what had occurred. These individuals whispered of supernatural possession, of restless spirits refusing to accept their fate, or of some cosmic imbalance that had allowed the boundary between life and death to be breached. The local medical community found itself in an impossible position. Dr. Clark, already struggling with doubts about his initial diagnosis, became the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism. Some accused him of incompetence, while others suggested that he had been part of some elaborate deception designed to cover up medical malpractice. Under pressure from village officials, and increasingly desperate to understand what had occurred, Dr. Clark requested that Lisa's coffin be opened for a more thorough examination. What he found inside would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The body of Lisa Royce lay exactly as it had been positioned for the funeral service, but subtle changes were unmistakable to the trained eye. The girl's fingers, which had been carefully arranged in a peaceful position across her chest, were now curled slightly, as if she had been grasping at something. More disturbing still, there were small tears in the lining of the coffin, and the interior wood showed clear evidence of scratching and clawing. But it was the girl's expression that proved most unsettling. While death typically renders the human face peaceful and serene, Lisa's features bore a look of profound confusion and distress, as if she had awakened to find herself trapped in circumstances beyond her understanding. Dr. Clark's official report, filed with local authorities 3 days after the funeral incident, concluded that Lisa Royce had indeed been alive at the time of her original examination, and had likely died sometime during the funeral service itself. The implications were staggering. Not only had a living person been nearly buried alive, but she had somehow possessed the strength of a village outside Boston. Instead, the incident seemed to herald the beginning of an even more disturbing chapter in what was already an incomprehensible tale. Reports began filtering in from various members of the community of strange sightings near St. Mary's Chapel and the adjacent cemetery. These accounts, initially dismissed as the product of overwrought imaginations, gradually accumulated into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Mrs. Dorothy Caldwell, who lived in a cottage adjacent to the churchyard, reported seeing a young woman in white moving among the headstones on 3 separate occasions. "She walks so slowly," Mrs. Caldwell confided to her neighbor, "as if each step requires tremendous effort. And when the moonlight catches her face, it looks exactly like poor Lisa Royce." Similar reports came from the night watchmen who patrolled the village streets, from travelers passing through on the Boston Road, and from children who claimed to see a girl in a white dress watching them from the shadows of the church. These sightings culminated in an event that would force authorities to take action they had hoped to avoid. On the night of April 3rd, exactly 3 weeks after the funeral incident, groundskeeper William Hayes discovered clear evidence that Lisa's grave had been disturbed. The earth above her burial plot was loose and scattered, as if something had emerged from below, and there were unmistakable handprints in the soil around the grave marker. More disturbing still were the reports from that same night of screams emanating from the direction of the cemetery. Not the sharp cries of the living, but something else entirely, something that several witnesses described as the sound of someone calling for help from a great distance or from beneath the earth itself. Faced with mounting pressure from terrified villagers and unable to explain the escalating phenomena, local authorities made the unprecedented decision to exhume Lisa Royce's coffin for a thorough examination. The procedure, conducted under the supervision of Dr. Clark and witnessed by village officials, revealed horrors that would remain etched in the memories of all present for the rest of their lives. The coffin, differently than they had been at burial. Instead of being folded peacefully across a chest, they were raised above her head, as if she had been pushing against the coffin lid in a desperate attempt to escape her wooden prison. Dr. Clark's examination revealed evidence that Lisa had indeed been alive when buried, and had survived for some time beneath the earth, before finally succumbing to suffocation. The implications sent shockwaves through the medical community, and forced authorities to confront the possibility that premature burial was far more common than anyone had dared to imagine. But even as officials grappled with the medical and legal implications of their discovery, the supernatural elements of Lisa's case continued to defy rational explanation. How had she appeared at her own funeral if she had been buried alive? What force had allowed her to seemingly exist in 2 places simultaneously? And why had the disturbances at her grave only begun after her coffin had already been in the ground for weeks? The revelation of Lisa Royce's premature burial and the mounting evidence of supernatural phenomena surrounding her case attracted attention far beyond the borders of the small Massachusetts village. By late April of 1893, newspaper reporters from Boston, New York, and even as far away as Philadelphia had descended upon the community, eager to document what they sensed was a story that would captivate the entire nation. The Boston Herald ran the first major story under the headline, "Girl Alive at Her Own Funeral, Medical Miracle or Something More Sinister." The article, published on April 10th, provided a detailed account of the funeral incident and subsequent exhumation, complete with interviews from eyewitnesses and expert commentary from medical professionals. The story was quickly picked up by newspapers across New England and beyond. The New York Tribune published a sensational piece titled, "The Royce Mystery. Did Death Itself Make an Error?" while the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a lengthy investigation under the banner, "Between Life and Death, the Impossible Case of Lisa Royce." These articles brought national attention to the case, but they also attracted unwelcome scrutiny from government officials who had been quietly monitoring the situation. The Massachusetts State Board of Dr. Blackwood's findings, detailed in a confidential report filed with state authorities, acknowledged that Lisa Royce had indeed been buried alive due to a misdiagnosis of death. However, his report also contained troubling admissions that suggested the case was far more complex than simple medical error. While the evidence clearly indicates that Miss Royce was alive at the time of her initial burial, Dr. Blackwood wrote, certain aspects of this case remain beyond current medical understanding. The witness accounts of her appearance at the funeral service, occurring simultaneously with her burial, cannot be explained through conventional means. Additionally, the reported phenomena following her burial suggest possibilities that challenge our fundamental understanding of the relationship between consciousness and death. Even more disturbing was Dr. Blackwood's private correspondence with his colleagues, letters that would not surface until decades later. In these documents, he expressed profound doubts about his public conclusions and admitted that he had been pressured by government officials to minimize certain aspects of his findings. There are elements of the Royce case, he wrote to his mentor at Harvard, that suggest we are dealing with phenomena beyond the scope of current medical science. The girl's ability to manifest physically while her body remained buried underground implies a form of consciousness or spiritual presence that our understanding of death cannot accommodate. I fear we are confronting something that challenges the very foundations of what we believe to be possible. The pressure to contain the story became evident when, in early May, newspapers that had been covering the case began retracting their articles or publishing follow-up pieces that dismissed earlier reports as exaggerated or inaccurate. The Boston Herald, which had broken the story nationally, published a brief retraction stating that further investigation has revealed that initial reports of supernatural phenomena in the Lisa Royce case were greatly exaggerated and likely the result of mass hysteria among grief-stricken villagers. More troubling still were reports that government officials had confiscated key pieces of evidence, including Lisa's coffin, her personal effects, and even the soil samples taken from her grave. Witnesses who had spoken freely to reporters in the early weeks following the incident. No amount of official explanation could erase the memory of what they had seen and experienced. The aftermath of the Lisa Royce incident cast a shadow over the small Massachusetts village that would linger for generations. The official conclusion that Lisa had been buried alive due to medical error, while disturbing enough in its own right, failed to address the supernatural elements that had made her case extraordinary. The Royce family, devastated by the loss of their daughter and traumatized by the circumstances surrounding her death and burial, found themselves increasingly isolated within their own community. While some neighbors offered support and sympathy, others began to view the family with suspicion and fear, as if they were somehow responsible for the inexplicable events that had unfolded. Thomas Royce, once a respected member of the village community, found his carpentry business suffering as customers began seeking services elsewhere. Margaret Royce, already fragile from grief, became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving her home except for essential errands. The couple's surviving children, Lisa's younger brother Michael and her older sister Catherine, faced whispers and stares wherever they went, bearing the burden of their family's notoriety. By the autumn of 1893, the Royces had made the painful decision to leave the village where they had lived for over 20 years. They sold their property at a significant loss to a buyer from a neighboring town who had not heard the stories surrounding their daughter's death, packed their few possessions, and departed one gray October morning before dawn, hoping to escape the memories and start fresh somewhere new. But even their departure could not bring an end to the strange phenomena that had begun with Lisa's funeral appearance. Village residents continued to report sightings of a young woman in white near St. Mary's Chapel, particularly during the twilight hours, when shadows grew long and the boundary between day and night became blurred. Mrs. Dorothy Caldwell, whose cottage overlooked the cemetery, maintained detailed records of these sightings in a journal that would later provide crucial documentation of the ongoing supernatural activity. Her entries, written in a careful, precise hand, chronicled encounters that occurred with disturbing regularity. During his early morning rounds, travelers on the Boston Road claimed to see a young woman walking along the cemetery fence. And even Reverend Whitmore admitted to congregation members that he had glimpsed a figure in white during his evening prayers at the chapel. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports from children in the village, who seemed particularly sensitive to Lisa's presence. Young Samuel Morrison, who had claimed to hear Lisa speak during the funeral service, began experiencing nightmares in which she appeared to him with messages he couldn't understand. Other children reported seeing her in their peripheral vision during school lessons or while playing near the church, always there for just a moment before vanishing when they turned to look directly. The supernatural activity extended beyond mere sightings. Groundskeeper William Hayes documented numerous instances of disturbances at Lisa's gravesite. Flowers left by visitors would be rearranged in patterns that spelled out words or phrases. Stones would be moved to form geometric shapes, and on several occasions messages appeared to be scratched into the soil near her headstone. One such message, photographed by a visiting journalist before being quickly obscured by church officials, read simply, "I am not gone." Another, discovered by Hayes during his morning rounds, asked, "Why can't you see me?" These phenomena continued through the winter months, though they seemed to intensify during periods of particular significance. The anniversary of Lisa's death, her birthday, and especially during the month of March, when her original funeral had taken place. Local authorities, already exhausted by the attention the case had received and eager to put the matter behind them, discouraged residents from reporting these incidents and instructed the village postman to route around the cemetery during his delivery rounds. But the supernatural activity could not be so easily dismissed or contained. By the spring of 1894, exactly 1 year after Lisa's extraordinary funeral appearance, strange occurrences began extending beyond the immediate vicinity of St. Mary's Chapel. Residents throughout the village reported dreams in which Lisa appeared to them, sometimes as the healthy young woman, and psychic phenomena. A team led by Dr. Edmund Hartley, professor of psychology and a noted skeptic of supernatural claims, arrived in the village in the summer of 1894 to conduct what they termed a scientific investigation of alleged psychic manifestations. Dr. Hartley's team spent 3 weeks in the village, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and conducting overnight vigils at St. Mary's Chapel and the adjacent cemetery. Their findings, published in the Journal of Psychological Research in late 1894, represented one of the first academic attempts to apply scientific methodology to the study of supernatural phenomena. The researchers documented multiple instances of unexplained activity during their stay, including the appearance of mysterious lights near Lisa's grave, unexplained temperature fluctuations in the chapel, and what they described as auditory phenomena consistent with human vocal communication, though no living human source could be identified. Most significantly, Dr. Hartley himself reported a direct encounter with what he believed to be Lisa's spirit during a midnight vigil on his final night in the village. According to his confidential notes, later discovered in his private papers, he observed a luminous figure near the cemetery that bore a clear resemblance to descriptions of Lisa Royce. The apparition appeared to be attempting communication, Dr. Hartley wrote, though the words were indistinct and seemed to come from a great distance. However, the emotional content of the communication was unmistakable. Profound confusion, desperate longing for connection, and what I can only describe as existential terror at finding herself caught between states of being. Dr. Hartley's team departed the village with more questions than answers, their scientific skepticism shaken by encounters that defied rational explanation. Their published report, while carefully worded to avoid sensationalism, acknowledged that the phenomena surrounding Lisa Royce represented genuine anomalies that warranted further investigation. But such investigation would prove difficult to pursue. By the mid-1890s, official interest in the case had waned, and the Massachusetts State Board of Health, 1900s. Dr. Margaret Wheeler, a historian specializing in New England folklore, discovered that crucial documents related to Lisa's death and burial had been removed from official records. The original death certificate signed by Dr. Clark was missing from county files, as was the coroner's report from the exhumation and Dr. Blackwood's official investigation. Church records from St. Mary's Chapel showed gaps in their documentation for the spring of 1893, and even newspaper archives from the period had been edited to remove articles about the case. Most troubling of all was the discovery that Lisa Royce's name had been systematically erased from many official documents. Census records that should have included her were found to have been altered, with her entry either removed entirely or obscured beyond recognition. School enrollment records from the village showed similar tampering, and even her birth certificate could not be located in state archives. This deliberate suppression of information suggested a coordinated effort to erase Lisa Royce from the historical record, though the motivation for such an undertaking remained unclear. Some researchers theorized that government officials were concerned about public panic regarding premature burial, while others suggested that the supernatural elements of the case were seen as a threat to established religious and scientific doctrines. Whatever the reason, the effect was to transform Lisa Royce from a documented historical figure into something approaching myth. By the 1920s, most official records of her existence had vanished, leaving only oral traditions and private documents to preserve the memory of what had occurred in that small Massachusetts village. These oral traditions, passed down through families and community groups, proved remarkably consistent in their details, suggesting that the events surrounding Lisa's death and burial had left an indelible impression on those who witnessed them. Even as official records disappeared, the story survived in the collective memory of the community, evolving and adapting, but retaining its essential elements. Children who had known Lisa grew up to tell their own children about the girl who appeared at her own funeral, and those children carried the story forward to subsequent generations. The tale became part of the local folklore. Lisa's grave marker still stood, became a focal point for supernatural activity that extended well beyond the original incidents of 1893 and 1894. Visitors to the cemetery reported a range of phenomena: unexplained cold spots near Lisa's grave, the sound of weeping when no one else was present, and the persistent sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Photographers attempting to document the cemetery found that their images frequently showed unexplained anomalies, shadowy figures, strange lights, and in some cases, what appeared to be the transparent form of a young woman standing among the headstones. Local children continued to be particularly sensitive to these phenomena, often refusing to play near the cemetery or claiming to see and hear things that adults could not perceive. Teachers at the village school reported that students would occasionally become distressed for no apparent reason when walking past the church, and several families moved away from the area after their children began experiencing persistent nightmares, featuring a girl in white who spoke of being lost and unable to find her way home. The persistence of these supernatural manifestations, spanning decades rather than months or years, suggested that whatever had been unleashed by Lisa's premature burial and extraordinary funeral appearance had become a permanent fixture of the local spiritual landscape. Unlike typical ghost stories that faded with time, the phenomena associated with Lisa Royce seemed to strengthen rather than diminish as the years passed. By the 1930s, the village had developed an uneasy relationship with its supernatural resident. While most residents acknowledged the reality of the phenomena surrounding Lisa's grave, there was an unspoken agreement to avoid discussing the matter with outsiders. Tourism to the area was actively discouraged, and local businesses avoided any reference to the supernatural history that had made their community notorious. This policy of deliberate obscurity was challenged, occasionally, by researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers who had heard fragments of the Lisa Royce story and sought to investigate further. However, they typically found themselves frustrated by a wall of silence from local residents who had learned that discussing the case brought unwelcome attention, and sometimes reporting that her appearance seemed to be evolving, aging in ways that suggested the passage of time affected even those caught between life and death. Instead of the 14-year-old girl who had appeared at her own funeral, observers began describing a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s or 30s, still recognizable as Lisa, but bearing the maturity that decades of existence, even supernatural existence, might bring. Her demeanor also seemed to change, with witnesses reporting that she appeared less confused and desperate, more purposeful in her movements and interactions with the physical world. These changes culminated in a series of incidents during the 1960s that marked a new chapter in the ongoing Lisa Royce mystery. Multiple witnesses reported extensive communications with her spirit, conversations that provided insights into the nature of her existence and the reasons for her continued presence in the village. According to these accounts, Lisa had gradually come to understand her situation and had developed the ability to interact more effectively with the living world. She reportedly explained that her consciousness had been severed from her physical body at the moment of her premature burial, creating a form of existence that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. More disturbing still were her claims that she was not alone in this liminal state, that there were others like her, victims of medical errors, accidents, and tragedies who found themselves trapped between worlds, unable to move on to whatever lay beyond death, but equally unable to return to the world of the living. These communications, documented by several independent witnesses, including a retired minister and a former newspaper reporter who had covered the original case, suggested that Lisa's situation represented not an isolated incident, but rather a glimpse into a hidden reality that existed parallel to the everyday world. According to her messages, transmitted through various means, including automatic writing, seance sessions, and direct apparitions, the boundary between life and death was far more complex and permeable than most people understood. Lisa spoke of existing in what she described as the gray space, a realm that overlapped with both the world of the living and whatever lay beyond death, but belonged fully to neither. The Undertaker. Most chilling was her account of the funeral service itself, during which she claimed to have experienced a form of bilocation, existing simultaneously as a consciousness observing from outside her body and as a desperate spirit struggling within her coffin. Her appearance at the church had been a manifestation of her overwhelming need to communicate her situation to her family and friends, a psychic projection born of terror and love. But it was Lisa's descriptions of her time buried alive that proved most haunting. According to her communications, she had regained full consciousness within her coffin shortly after burial, awakening to absolute darkness and the crushing weight of earth above her. Her desperate attempts to escape, evidenced by the scratches and damage found during the exhumation, had lasted for hours or perhaps days before her physical body finally succumbed to suffocation. Even more disturbing was her claim that her consciousness had remained active even after her physical death, trapped within the confines of her grave, experiencing a form of existence that was simultaneously death and a terrible parody of life. Only gradually, over months and years, had she learned to project herself beyond the boundaries of her burial site and interact with the world above ground. These communications continued sporadically through the 1970s and 80s, with Lisa's spirit apparently growing stronger and more articulate over time. Witnesses reported increasingly detailed conversations about her experiences, her observations of the changes occurring in the village and the wider world, and her growing understanding of her own supernatural condition. During this period, researchers from various universities and paranormal organizations attempted to study the Lisa Royce phenomena using increasingly sophisticated equipment and methodologies. Temperature sensors documented dramatic fluctuations near her gravesite. Electromagnetic field detectors registered unusual readings in the chapel, and audio recording equipment captured unexplained voices and sounds. Photography sessions produced images that defied conventional explanation, transparent figures appearing in otherwise empty spaces, mysterious lights that seemed to move within the scientific community, provided unprecedented insights into the nature of consciousness after death and the experiences of those trapped between worlds. Lisa's voice, captured on high-quality audio equipment, was analyzed by acoustic specialists who confirmed that the vocal patterns were consistent with those of a young woman from late 19th century New England. The content of these communications ranged from personal memories of her life and death to philosophical discussions about the nature of existence and consciousness. Lisa demonstrated knowledge of events that had occurred long after her death, suggesting that spirits trapped in her condition retained the ability to observe and learn about the ongoing world. But perhaps most disturbing were her warnings about the increasing frequency of cases similar to her own. According to Lisa's communications, improvements in medical technology had reduced but not eliminated instances of premature burial and misdiagnosed death, and she claimed to be aware of other spirits trapped in similar circumstances throughout New England and beyond. These warnings proved prophetic when, in 1985, a case remarkably similar to Lisa's occurred in a town less than 50 miles from the original incident. A young man named David Thornton was pronounced dead following a motorcycle accident, only to appear at his own wake 3 days later, terrifying mourners before vanishing without explanation. Subsequent investigation revealed that Thornton's body showed signs of movement and struggle after burial, and witnesses reported supernatural phenomena similar to those associated with Lisa Royce. The Thornton case, while receiving brief media attention, was quickly suppressed by authorities, using methods similar to those employed in Lisa's case nearly a century earlier. Documents were sealed, witnesses were discouraged from speaking publicly, and official records were altered or destroyed to minimize evidence of the supernatural elements involved. This pattern of suppression, repeated in several similar cases documented over the following decades, suggested that the phenomena associated with premature burial and consciousness survival after death were far more common than publicly acknowledged. Government and medical authorities appeared to maintain active policies designed to prevent public grave continued unabated. The village, now grown into a small town with suburban developments spreading outward from its historic center, found itself dealing with supernatural activity that had persisted for over a century. New residents, unaware of the area's history, frequently reported strange experiences near the old chapel and cemetery. Real estate agents learned to avoid showing properties near St. Mary's Chapel, and those homes that were sold in the area typically changed hands frequently, as residents experienced phenomena they could neither understand nor tolerate. Children born in the town seemed particularly sensitive to Lisa's presence, often mentioning an imaginary friend who matched her description, or claiming to see a sad lady in white who wanted to go home. The persistence and consistency of these reports across multiple generations suggested that whatever had been set in motion by Lisa's premature burial in 1893 had become a permanent feature of the local spiritual landscape. Unlike typical hauntings that fade over time, the phenomena associated with Lisa Royce appeared to strengthen rather than diminish, as if her consciousness was drawing energy from the ongoing passage of time and the accumulated emotional resonance of her story. Local historians and genealogists, working independently of official suppression efforts, began piecing together a more complete picture of Lisa's life and the circumstances surrounding her death. Through careful research in private family records, church documents that had escaped official censorship, and oral histories passed down through generations, they were able to reconstruct many details of her story that had been deliberately erased from public records. These researchers discovered that Lisa Royce had been an unusually intelligent and perceptive young woman, known for her vivid dreams and occasional episodes of what would now be recognized as psychic sensitivity. Several family members and friends had noted her ability to predict minor events or sense things that others could not perceive, abilities that had been viewed with suspicion in the religious community of the late 19th century. More significantly, they found evidence that Lisa's family had a history of medical conditions that might have predisposed her to the cataleptic understanding of both life and death. As the 20th century drew to a close and the new millennium approached, the Lisa Royce case had evolved from a local tragedy into something approaching a spiritual landmark. Researchers, theologians, and philosophers from around the world had begun to recognize her story as a potential window into fundamental questions about consciousness, death, and the nature of existence itself. The phenomena surrounding her gravesite had been documented by hundreds of witnesses over more than a century, creating one of the most thoroughly recorded cases of supernatural activity in modern history. Yet despite this extensive documentation, official acknowledgement of the case remained elusive, suppressed by the same forces that had worked to erase Lisa from the historical record more than 100 years earlier. The persistence of this suppression suggested that Lisa's case touched on truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, death, and human consciousness. Her story implied that death was not the absolute termination that most people believed it to be, but rather a transition into forms of existence that mainstream science and religion were not prepared to acknowledge. As we stand now in the 21st century, more than 130 years after Lisa Royce first appeared at her own funeral, the questions raised by her case remain as compelling and unsettling as ever. The phenomena associated with her gravesite continue to be reported by new generations of witnesses, suggesting that whatever force was unleashed by her extraordinary death has become a permanent fixture of our reality. Modern technology has provided new methods for documenting and studying these phenomena, from thermal imaging cameras that record unexplained temperature variations to digital audio equipment that captures electronic voice phenomena in unprecedented clarity. Yet, despite these technological advances, the fundamental mystery of Lisa Royce's existence remains unsolved. What we do know challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of life and death. Lisa Royce, a 14-year-old girl from a small Massachusetts village, appears to have achieved, through tragic circumstance, what philosophers and theologians have debated for millennia. Long been aware that death is not the absolute boundary most people believe it to be. The implications of this knowledge, that consciousness can survive physical death, that premature burial may be more common than acknowledged, that the boundary between life and death is permeable and complex, are too threatening to established doctrines to be openly acknowledged. Yet despite more than a century of suppression, Lisa's story has survived, passed down through generations of witnesses, researchers, and believers, who recognize that her case represents something unprecedented in human experience. Her appearances at her own funeral, her century of supernatural manifestations, and her documented communications with the living world provide evidence that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The question that haunts us today, as it haunted the mourners in that small Massachusetts chapel in 1893, remains as compelling and terrifying as ever. If Lisa Royce stood in that church, staring at her own coffin, who or what was lying inside it? And if consciousness can survive the death of the body, what other secrets about the nature of existence have been hidden from us by those who fear the implications of such knowledge? In the end, Lisa Royce's story serves as both warning and revelation. A warning about the limitations of medical knowledge and the dangers of accepting death too readily, and a revelation about the persistence of consciousness beyond the boundaries that we have assumed to be absolute. Her century-long presence in that small Massachusetts cemetery stands as testimony to mysteries that our science and philosophy have yet to comprehend, and to truths that may be too disturbing for our comfortable assumptions about life and death to accommodate. As long as Lisa Royce continues her vigil beside her own grave, as long as witnesses continue to report encounters with the girl in white who should have died more than a century ago, her story will serve as a reminder that the boundary between life and death may be far more complex, far more permeable, and far more terrifying than we have ever dared to imagine.